So let me start with a question that's going to stay with you for the next hour. What if Princess Diana wrote a final letter to Prince William? A letter so explosive, so emotionally charged, so devastating in what it hinted at, that the palace spent decades trying to bury it. And what if that letter didn't stay buried? What if it resurfaced, quietly, anonymously, suddenly, at the exact moment when the royal family was least prepared for it? Here's the part that will make you lean in. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That letter didn't just reveal fears. It didn't just unveil secrets. It didn't just whisper warnings. It pointed a finger, not dramatically, not directly, but in a way only a mother could, in a way that made William freeze when he reached the final line. Because according to the person who delivered this letter, Diana believed there was someone who would one day erase her story and finish what they had begun. And the name she hinted at? The last person the world expected. Not an enemy, not a stranger, not a faceless threat lurking in the shadows. Someone far closer. Someone whose rise seemed to happen only after Diana's fall. Someone whose presence in the family Diana once described as a dark cloud she could not escape. Someone who has always existed in the blurred intersection between rumor and reality, loyalty and ambition, affection and rivalry. Camilla. So here's the question I want you to think about as we begin. If Diana truly feared Camilla's influence, what exactly did she see coming? Because this isn't a story about blame. This isn't about pointing fingers or rewriting history. This is about something deeper, something emotional, something human, something terrifying in the way it echoes across time. This is the story of a mother who sensed danger long before anyone else did. A woman who felt trapped. A woman who felt silenced. A woman who feared what might happen if she didn't leave behind her truth. And so she wrote. She wrote because she believed her son would one day need her words. And he did. But before we dive into the day that letter finally resurfaced, before we talk about how William reacted, or how Harry responded, or why palace officials went white as paper when they realized the letter was real, we need to go back. Back to the moment Diana decided to write those pages. But first, let me take you into the moment everything changed. You've seen the footage. You've heard the stories. You know the official narrative, a tragic accident, a city in shock, a world in mourning. But the world never saw what happened in the quiet hours before that night. The phone calls Diana made, the comments she whispered to close friends, the way she kept checking her rearview mirror, the way she told one person she felt watched, followed, observed. She said it more than once. And every time she said it, she looked over her shoulder. Now imagine being William. Imagine being a boy barely out of childhood, suddenly hearing whispers that his mother had fears no one took seriously. Imagine being told after her death that everything was perfectly normal, that nothing had been wrong, that nothing had been suspicious. But then imagine discovering, years later, that your mother had written a letter predicting she might not survive. Imagine finding out that she believed someone close to the royal family, someone deeply intertwined with her own past, posed a threat to her legacy, her reputation, her safety, or her place in history. Imagine opening that letter for the first time as an adult and reading the warning she wrote for you as a child. Would you feel anger, confusion, terror, a sense of betrayal? Would you feel like your entire world had been a carefully constructed narrative designed to protect everyone but the one person who deserved answers? Yourself? William didn't read the letter immediately. No, he was too young when she wrote it. Too fragile. Too vulnerable. Someone hid it. Someone kept it locked away. Someone believed that the truth, if revealed too early, would break him. And maybe they were right. But here's the twist. The person who kept the letter wasn't the person who delivered it. In fact, the palace had no idea the letter survived. They believed it was gone, burned, shredded, destroyed, forgotten. Like so many things Diana tried to preserve. But someone made a copy. Someone protected it. Someone waited. And the moment the royal family least expected, the letter resurfaced. Now let me ask you this. If you were William, what would you do with a letter like that? Would you hide it again? Would you share it with Harry? Would you confront your father? Would you question the people around you? Would you suddenly look at Camilla, not as your stepmother, not as your father's wife, but as the woman your mother feared? This is where the story turns from emotional to explosive. Because according to the anonymous source who resurfaced the letter, Diana wrote something chilling. I know who will rewrite my story. Not may, not might, not could, will. She believed it. She felt it. She feared it. And if you look at the timeline that followed, her divorce, her isolation, the shift in public narratives, the sudden rediscovery of her old interviews, and the rise of new royal figures, you start to see a pattern. Not a violent one, not a criminal one, not a dangerous one, but a pattern of erasure, a pattern of replacement, a pattern of a woman who felt pushed out of her own life long before she was gone. And that is the heart of this expose. Not crime, not violence, not graphic tragedy, but influence, power, history, control, fear, legacy. This is a psychological story, a political story, an emotional story about what it means to be silenced in a world where perception is everything. And Diana's final letter? It threatens that perception. You're going to hear about the way she described her emotional state. You're going to hear the way she spoke about being cornered. You're going to hear how she hinted at manipulation, isolation, and pressure. You're going to hear why she said she feared a future where her truth would be buried beneath someone else's version of events. Now, before we move forward, let me give you this image. William, now a grown man, sitting alone with the letter in his hands. A single lamp on. The room silent. His mother's handwriting staring back at him. Not typed. Not photocopied. Not transcribed. Her handwriting. The same loops he remembered watching her make as a boy. The same curves. The same little hearts she drew next to the names of her children. The same slant she used when she wrote something emotional or urgent. He recognizes it instantly. And for the first time in decades, he feels like he's hearing his mother's voice again. But what he reads, that's the moment that breaks him. Because the letter doesn't just reveal a fear. It reveals a truth he suspected for years, but never had proof of. His mother believed someone was trying to push her out of the royal narrative permanently. And as he reaches the end of the letter, he sees the line that changes everything. I know who is behind this. She doesn't write the name. She doesn't need to. She hints. She circles around it. She describes behavior, patterns, conversations. She references a woman whose presence loomed large in her life. She references a rivalry that never healed. And she warns William to stay away from the woman who will one day stand beside your father. The implications are enormous. Painful, complicated, dangerous, not physically, but politically, emotionally, historically. If true, this letter could destabilize the entire royal image the world believes today. So how did the palace react when they realized William had the letter? Not well. But we'll get to that later. For now, let me leave you with this. If Diana's warning was meant to protect William, why did it arrive so late? Who suppressed it? Who delivered it? And most importantly, why now? She knew something was wrong. That's the only place this chapter can begin. Not with the tragedy the world remembers, not with the headlines, not with the documentaries or commemorations, but with the quiet, unsettling truth that Princess Diana sensed danger long before anyone else recognized it. You've heard the phrase gut feeling, but Diana's intuition wasn't a vague discomfort. It was sharper, louder, persistent. What would you do if every instinct in your body whispered that something was about to happen, something you could feel but couldn't fully explain? For Diana, that whisper grew into a storm. And in the last 72 hours of her life, as reconstructed from diaries, accounts from close friends, staff recollections, and this exposé's fictional interpretation, that storm became impossible to ignore. Let me take you back to the exact moment she realized she was being watched. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't happen in a dark alley or on a secluded road. It happened in broad daylight. Diana had been staying in Paris, navigating a world she no longer felt anchored to. She was freer in some ways, divorced, independent, financially stable, beloved by millions. But emotionally, she was a woman standing between two lives, the one she had escaped and the one she was trying to build. And it was in that fragile space that she felt the shift. It happened in a hotel corridor. She walked past a decorative mirror, the kind placed too high and angled too oddly to be functional. But she caught something, a reflection that didn't belong. A person standing too still, eyes following her too closely. The unmistakable posture of someone whose attention wasn't casual. She paused, turned her head slightly, and just like that, the figure moved away. Not quickly, not suspiciously, but deliberately. as if they didn't want to be seen but didn't care if they were noticed. Diana inhaled sharply. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was recognition. Because this wasn't the first time. Not that week. Not that month. Not that year. There had been other moments. Tiny details that didn't make sense. A driver she didn't recognize lingering too long. A journalist appearing somewhere she hadn't publicly announced. A phone call where she heard a faint click, a sign of a line being crossed or monitored. Little things she once brushed off. But now, they connected. Just like that mirror reflection. She confided in a close friend that afternoon. Someone who had seen her through every emotional high and low. And what she said was chilling in its simplicity. I feel like someone is waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't say. Maybe she didn't know. But that statement frames the next 72 hours in a way most people never consider. Because while the world sees the tragic ending, very few talk about Diana's state of mind leading up to it. Her alertness, her tension, her awareness that something wasn't right. Now, you might wonder, why didn't she go to security? Why didn't she demand protection? Why didn't she tell her sons? That's the heartbreaking part. She did try, but her position was complicated. She was no longer a senior royal. Her security was limited. Her warnings were often dismissed as exaggerated or emotional. Even worse, some people around her believed she was imagining things. There was a moment the day before her death when she said quietly, almost under her breath, I need to write this down. Not because she wanted attention, not because she wanted drama, but because she wanted a record, a living record, a message that would survive even if she didn't. That's where the letter begins. That's where the seeds of her warnings were planted. But before we get to the writing of that letter, we need to understand the pattern Diana saw. The pattern that made her believe she was not simply unlucky or overly anxious, but intentionally monitored, perhaps even psychologically cornered. And that brings us to her final 72 hours. Let's start with the first major turning point. Day 1. Approximately 72 hours before the incident. Diana was seen pacing in a suite in Paris, restless, unsettled. She held her cell phone, a bulky model by today's standards, scrolling through calls she hadn't returned, messages she planned to send, reminders she had set for herself. It wasn't her normal habit. She wasn't the type to pace unless something was heavy on her mind. A staff member later recalled that Diana kept repeating the same sentence as she walked from one end of the room to the other. They want me quiet. Who exactly did she mean? She never clarified. But the way she said it, with a mix of exhaustion and defiance, suggested she believed it was someone within the royal orbit. Not necessarily a person with violent intent, but someone who wanted her out of the picture, socially, politically, publicly. Someone who wanted to control the narrative. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth Diana understood. Public sympathy was her greatest power. Influence she never asked for, but undeniably wielded. And what happens when a woman holds influence in a system designed to silence her? You already know the answer. Her independence becomes a threat. Her voice becomes dangerous. Her charisma becomes unmanageable. The palace, the tabloids, the establishment, they all needed her to stay in a certain box. Demure, quiet, cooperative. But Diana wasn't built for boxes. And that's what made her final 72 hours so tense. On the second day, 48 hours before the tragedy, Diana did something she rarely did. She isolated herself. She canceled dinner plans. She told Dodi she needed space. She took a long walk around the hotel's rooftop area just after sunset. There, away from cameras, away from crowds, away from pressure, she spoke aloud to no one in particular, as if rehearsing something she planned to say or write. One sentence stood out to a staff member who overheard her. They're going to twist my story. They're going to turn me into someone I'm not. Not destroy, not harm, not eliminate. Twist, rewrite, replace. Erase her version of events and replace it with another. That fear speaks volumes. It suggests that Diana didn't believe her biggest threat was physical. It was reputational, emotional, psychological, historical. Exactly the kind of danger a letter could protect against. But the third day, Diana's final 24 hours, was the most unsettling. Not tragic, not dramatic, just strange. She woke unusually early. She made several private calls, one after the other. No one knows exactly what she said during those calls, but one friend later revealed that her voice was tight and frightened. And then came the most disturbing moment of all. A car followed hers. Not aggressively, not noticeably, but consistently. This wasn't paparazzi. She could tell the difference. This was a single car, maintaining distance, appearing at multiple points in the city, even when routes changed. Her driver noticed it too. "Do you want me to lose them?" he asked. Diana paused, and her answer was telling. No. If they wanted to hide, they wouldn't be following at all. Think about that. Let it sit with you. She believed whoever was watching her wasn't trying to stay hidden. They wanted to be seen. They wanted her to know they were there. Why? What message were they sending? What were they trying to trigger? Fear? Silence? Submission? That afternoon, she retreated to her suite again. And this is the moment everything begins to connect. She sat at the desk, took out a pen, grabbed hotel stationery, and she began writing. Not typing, not dictating. Writing. Handwriting is personal. Handwriting is deliberate. Handwriting is intimate. Handwriting is dangerous when you're a woman whose voice is already too powerful for the system containing you. But she wrote anyway. She wrote as if she knew this letter might be the only part of her story that would survive untouched. And while this chapter isn't the place where we reveal the contents, that comes later, there's something important to understand. Diana didn't write out of fear of an accident. She wrote out of fear of revision, fear of what would be said about her, fear of who would shape her legacy, fear of who might step into the spotlight where she once stood. And yes, fear of one particular woman gaining influence in the royal family's inner sphere. A woman she believed would one day stand beside Charles. A woman she believed would attempt to overwrite the past. A woman she believed would replace her, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as a narrative. Story is power, influence, currency. Diana knew it. Camilla knew it. The palace knew it. The world learned it. Which is why the letter mattered. Which is why the palace panicked when it resurfaced. Which is why William's reaction was so intense. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still in those final hours. And here's the detail most people don't know, even in fictional retellings. Diana tried to make one final phone call before the day ended. She dialed a number. The call didn't go through. She dialed again. Still nothing. She looked frustrated, disappointed, unsettled. The number she was trying to reach? Prince Charles. Not to fight, not to argue, not to confront, but to say something important, something she didn't get the chance to. A staff member who saw her afterward claimed she looked heartbroken, emotionally raw, yet strangely calm, like a woman who had accepted something she had been fighting for too long. And that brings us to the final hours, the last stretch before the world changed forever. Diana showered, changed clothes, packed lightly, moved methodically, almost ritualistically. She wasn't running. She wasn't panicking. She was preparing. For what? That's the mystery. Some say she was planning to return to London the next morning. Some say she intended to release a news statement. Some say she planned to confront someone in the palace. Some say she intended to show the letter to someone trusted. The truth, at least in this fictional interpretation, is much more emotional. She wanted to speak to William and Harry, not about fear, not about danger, but about love, to reassure them, to connect with them, to ground herself in the only truth she fully trusted, her sons. But she never got the chance. And here's the part that ties this entire expose together. Her letter, written hours earlier, was left folded, imperfectly tucked into a book she planned to take home. A book about healing. A book about rebuilding. A book about finding strength after turmoil. The letter stayed behind. And for nearly 3 decades, it remained in the shadows, quietly waiting to be discovered, recognized, and finally read. But the story of that letter? The reason she wrote it? The warnings she left inside it? Those revelations come later. Because what happens next, what unfolds in Chapter 2, is the turning point that explains everything. Why she wrote it. Why she feared her story would be rewritten. Why she believed someone close to the royal family would eventually reshape her legacy. And most importantly, why William needed to read that letter more than anyone else. She didn't write letters. Not like this. Not handwritten pages sealed away like a confession, a warning, and a prophecy all in one. Diana was expressive, emotional, thoughtful, but she wasn't someone who documented her fears unless those fears became too heavy to keep inside. So ask yourself this. What could push a woman who spent her life under relentless public scrutiny to sit down alone, put pen to paper, and write words intended for her son to read years, maybe decades, later. A mother writes to protect. A survivor writes to remember. But someone who senses that their story is about to be rewritten writes to fight back. And that's exactly what Diana was doing. The question is, against who? Against what? Against which force in her life was she defending her truth? The answer wasn't a stranger. It wasn't the press. It wasn't fate or misfortune. It was someone she knew. Someone who had been in her life from the very beginning of her marriage. Someone she believed would one day rise in influence, reshape the royal narrative, and intentionally reduce Diana from a central figure to a cautionary tale. Camilla. But here's the twist you probably didn't expect. Diana didn't fear Camilla because of romance, or jealousy, or the triangle the world already knows. That story has been told to exhaustion. The real fear, the deeper fear, the one Diana never truly expressed publicly, was that Camilla understood the royal system in a way Diana never did. Camilla knew the rules. She knew the players. She knew how influence worked behind closed doors, where no cameras could reach. She knew how reputations could be quietly reshaped with a single meeting, a whispered suggestion, or a strategically timed leak to the press. And Diana? She was playing a game she never agreed to join. She once said to a friend, and this is where the emotional weight begins. Camilla doesn't just want a place. She wants a role. And when someone wants a role badly enough, they rewrite the script. Diana saw it happening long before anyone else did. Let's go back. Not to the accident, not to the tragedy, but to years before, when her marriage to Charles was still a facade the world believed was real. Diana wasn't naive. She saw the way Charles looked at Camilla. She felt the emotional distance. She sensed the quiet yet unshakable connection between them. But beyond the personal pain, beyond the heartbreak, Diana noticed something more subtle. Camilla wasn't just in Charles's life. She was in his ear. Everywhere Diana turned, she felt the consequences of conversations she wasn't part of. A story in the press. A rumor that seemed to come from nowhere. A shift in tone from royal advisors. A meeting she wasn't invited to. A narrative forming around her that she couldn't control. She once described it as a slow and elegant removal. Not a push. Not a confrontation. A quiet erasure. Do you know how terrifying that is? To be alive, visible, adored, yet slowly phased out of your own story? To be treated not as a central figure, but as a temporary inconvenience? To feel the walls of influence narrowing around you, even as the cameras flash brighter and brighter? This is what Diana feared. This is why she started writing. Because she knew, not suspected, not imagined, but knew, that one day the palace would attempt to reshape the narrative of her life and her role. And she believed Camilla would be at the center of that reshaping. Diana had a gift many people misunderstood. She saw patterns early. She noticed shifts that others dismissed. She felt the emotional undercurrents in every interaction. And one of the clearest signs she saw was this. The more the world loved Diana, the more certain people within the royal circle felt threatened by her. Not for her beauty, not for her fame, but for the one thing the monarchy could never control. Her influence, public affection, global attention, emotional power. Diana had what no royal PR machine could fabricate. Authenticity. And authenticity, in an institution built on image, is a dangerous thing. It makes people unpredictable. It makes them beloved. It makes them irreplaceable. And Camilla, whether intentionally or not, represented the opposite kind of power. Structured, quiet, indirect, political. She was everything Diana wasn't, and everything the palace understood. Deep inside, Diana feared that after her divorce, after the public breakdown of her marriage, after the scandals and the interviews and the emotional revelations, the monarchy would find it easier to rebuild its image around someone predictable rather than someone explosive. Someone like Camilla. And the heartbreaking truth is this. Diana didn't fear losing Charles. She feared losing her story. She feared waking up one day and realizing that she had been replaced not just as a partner, but as a symbol. She feared that her humanitarian work, her compassion, her struggles, her vulnerability, her pain, everything she had lived, would be overshadowed or even overwritten by the palace's preferred narrative. And that narrative would have a new leading woman. Diana told her therapist once, and this detail has haunted many since. I feel like I'm being erased in slow motion. Imagine feeling that. Imagine watching it happen in real time. Imagine knowing exactly who would replace you in the public eye. Now, let me ask you something. If you felt your legacy slipping away, if you believed someone else was preparing to take your place, not just beside your ex-husband, but in history, if you feared that your truth would be sanitized, softened, or buried, would you stay silent? Of course not. You would write. You would document. You would preserve your truth. You would leave something behind that no institution, no advisor, no palace strategist could ever erase. A letter. Not for the world. Not for the press. Not for revenge. For the only person she trusted with the truth. William. Because William was the one who would inherit everything. The crown, the legacy, the public role, the weight of history. And Diana believed that if anyone needed to know what really happened, what she really feared, what she truly saw coming, it was him. And here's where things get even more emotional. She didn't write one draft. She wrote several. One was too emotional. One was too vague. One revealed too much. One revealed too little. The final version, the one William would eventually receive, was handwritten with a slow, careful, trembling script. Not because Diana was afraid of the moment, but because she was afraid of being misinterpreted. She wrote with precision. She wrote with intention. She wrote with love. But she also wrote with tension in her chest and lightning in her mind. This was her final safeguard. Her last attempt to protect her truth from the quiet machine she felt was moving against her. She never said Camilla will hurt me. She never accused her of harm. She never suggested anything physical. What she said was far more chilling. She will replace me. Pause. Think about how devastating that is. Not physically, emotionally, historically. The idea that another woman, one she saw as the reason for her suffering, would one day stand where she once stood, reshape the public perception of Charles, and potentially overshadow everything Diana contributed to the world. That fear was the heart of the letter. Diana believed that Camilla's rise would coincide with a rewriting of Diana's role in history, turning her from a revolutionary into a footnote. That was her nightmare. And when a woman fears the rewriting of her life, she does something powerful. She writes her own version first. This chapter wouldn't be complete without understanding the deeper emotional layer. Diana wasn't writing from paranoia. She was writing from pattern recognition. She had seen narratives twist before. She had seen how the palace handled scandals, stories, reputations. She had seen how the institution could reshape perception with a single well-timed announcement. And she had already witnessed the early stages of her own diminishing narrative. Suddenly, she was being described as unstable, irrational, emotional, difficult. Words that conveniently weaken a woman's credibility. Words that soften the impact of her truth. Words that prepare the public for her eventual replacement. Diana knew exactly what those words were designed to do, and she refused to let them win. So she wrote the letter to make sure William would one day know the truth. Not the public version, not the palace version, not the sanitized version. But her version. The version only a mother could give. And here's the part that connects everything. She didn't hide her fear. She didn't hide her frustration. But she also didn't hide her hope. In the letter, she hinted at the future. A future where William would become a leader. A future where he would understand the pressures she once faced. A future where the truth would matter more than reputation. She told him to trust his instincts. To guard his heart. To believe what he sees, not what he is told. And then she wrote the line that would haunt him more than any other. There is someone who will try to rewrite my story. You will know who when the time comes. Not dangerous, not harmful, but rewriting, reshaping, redefining, recasting, replacing. And when the letter resurfaced decades later, long after Diana's passing, that line became the spark that ignited everything that followed. But here's the twist that takes us directly into Chapter 3. Diana didn't write the letter because of a single event. She wrote it because of a moment, a confrontation, that changed everything. A moment she never spoke of publicly. A moment that happened behind palace walls. A moment that confirmed her deepest fear, that someone was actively preparing to step into her place. And that moment is the one no one in the royal family ever wanted revealed. There are moments in royal history that never make it into documentaries. Moments that never appear in biographies, interviews, or official timelines. Moments whispered in corridors, documented only in memory, carried like a weight by the few who witnessed them. This is one of those moments. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't the kind of explosive scene tabloids dream about. It was worse. It was quiet. And in royal circles, quiet confrontations are the most dangerous ones of all. So let's set the scene. The palace was unusually still that evening. One of those nights when the building feels more like a museum than a home. The kind of quiet where footsteps echo longer than they should, and every word spoken seems to float in a vacuum. Diana had been invited to a private discussion. Not a meeting, not a briefing, a discussion. In royal vocabulary, that word is code. It means, there is something we want you to accept. There is something we want you to understand. There is something you will not like. And she knew it the moment she stepped into the room. It wasn't Charles who called the meeting. He was present, yes, sitting stiffly, hands clasped, eyes avoiding hers. But he wasn't leading it. The person who spoke first was an advisor, one of the senior ones. The kind who stays in the background of every royal photo. The kind whose influence is enormous, but whose name is rarely known to the public. The kind who shapes narratives. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if Diana had a choice. His tone was soft. Too soft. Diana had learned to fear soft tones. Soft tones were how decisions were delivered. Soft tones were how expectations were disguised as requests. Soft tones were the prelude to losing something important. She sat down, waited. Another advisor shifted a folder on the table. Neat, precise, intentional. And then came the sentence that made every muscle in Diana's body tighten. "We want to move forward with a new communication strategy." Of course they did. The palace always wants a new communication strategy. But the implications are never small. Diana raised an eyebrow. Which part of the communications requires strategy? A long pause. Too long. And then the advisor inhaled slowly and said, "The part that concerns your legacy." Legacy. That word hit her like cold water. Legacy wasn't about public events. Legacy wasn't about photo ops. Legacy wasn't about schedules or charities. Legacy meant history, the future, the narrative that lives long after someone is gone. And if the palace wanted to strategize her legacy, it meant one thing. They were preparing to redefine it. She crossed her legs, sat a little straighter, and said, "Define what you mean by that." Another advisor took over, this one younger, more polished, with the kind of diplomatic smile that hides every true intention. "We have been discussing ways to present the royal family more cohesively, to protect its public image, to strengthen its unity." Unity, another coded word. Unity often means blend lines, remove contradictions, eliminate friction, choose one version of the story, and that version rarely belongs to the person with the least institutional power. Diana felt the air shift. She could sense a direction forming, a shape taking place in the words being carefully chosen. But it was the third advisor, an older woman with a rigid posture, who said the part Diana would never forget. "There needs to be a clearer distinction between your past role and the future roles of others who will be stepping forward." Others. Stepping forward. Diana's chest tightened. "Are you referring to Camilla?" she asked. The silence that followed was deafening. And silence is an answer in itself. Finally, Charles spoke, softly, almost mechanically. "It's inevitable, Diana." That was the moment the confrontation truly began. Not in volume, not in anger, but in the unspoken truth hanging heavily in the room. They were preparing to elevate Camilla publicly. They were beginning the process of reshaping her image. They were positioning her to take the place Diana once held in the narrative, not as the wife, but as the stabilizing figure beside Charles. And to do that, they needed Diana's story softened, reduced, reframed. Diana leaned back slowly, her face unreadable. Inside, her thoughts were racing. So this was it. This was the threat she had predicted. The shift she felt coming. The reason she felt the need to document her truth. Because here, in this quiet, suffocating room, she was being told that her public identity, her story, was now considered in the way. She took a slow breath and asked, "So you want to reposition me?" Again, silence. The older female advisor finally replied, "It's not about repositioning. It's about clarity. You have your humanitarian work. You have your independence. But Camilla will eventually take on a more defined role, and we need the public to understand that without confusion." Diana's eyes narrowed. Confusion? She repeated the word like a challenge. What confusion? The advisor looked down at her notes before continuing. The confusion of two narratives competing for prominence. There it was. The truth. They didn't want two stories. Two versions of the past. Two women symbolizing two eras. They wanted one narrative. And that narrative would center on Charles and Camilla. Diana realized in that instant that they weren't just asking her to step aside physically. She already had. They were asking her to step aside historically. To allow the image of Charles and Camilla to overwrite the image of Charles and Diana. A quiet erasure. A polite removal. A velvet-gloved rewrite of history. But Diana wasn't passive. She wasn't naive. She wasn't controllable. She leaned forward, her voice steady, and said, "So let me understand. You want me to fade quietly so someone else can step into my place?" The young advisor's smile tightened. Not fade. Simply transition. Transition. Another word that means the opposite of what it claims. This was the exact kind of carefully curated language Diana feared. Language designed to soothe while cutting deeply. Language used by institutions to make final decisions feel like polite suggestions. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "That's not a transition. That's a replacement." Charles flinched, and for the first time, Diana saw something in his eyes. Not guilt, not anger, but discomfort. Because even he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The advisors exchanged glances. They had expected resistance. They had not expected clarity. One of them began speaking again, trying to soften the blow. "Diana, your role is unique. No one is saying otherwise. The public will always remember you as a beloved figure. But over time," she cut him off instantly. "Over time," she repeated, "you expect them to forget." Why did that sentence hit so hard? Because it was the truth she had always feared. She wasn't worried about Camilla taking her place in Charles's life. That wound had healed long ago. She was worried about Camilla taking her place in the story the monarchy presents to the world. That was the threat. Not physical, not violent, symbolic, narrative, historical. Because in powerful institutions, the rewriting of a story can be more destructive than anything else. The conversation stretched on, each advisor circling back to the same point. Public unity, messaging, strategy, reframed reputation, softened legacy, reduced narrative. And every time a new phrase was delivered, Diana heard the real meaning beneath it. Erase, replace, recast, reposition, reinterpret. Finally, when the conversation reached its quiet, suffocating peak, Diana did something none of them expected. She stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm finality that made every person in the room fall silent. She looked each advisor in the eye. She looked at Charles last. And then she said the sentence that would echo through history, a sentence few heard, but none forgot. "I will not let anyone rewrite who I am." It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It was a declaration, a refusal, a line drawn in sand. The advisors shifted uncomfortably. Charles swallowed hard. The room pulsed with a tension thicker than anything that had come before. Diana reached for her bag, placed her hand on the doorknob, stopped, and then, without turning around, she added quietly, "You may control the institution. You may control the press. You may control the rules. But you will not control my truth." And she left. No shouting. No slamming doors. No dramatics. A quiet exit from a quiet confrontation. But the effect? Earthquake level. Because the advisors were left with the realization that the woman they had hoped would quietly accept her diminishing role had instead declared a silent war. Not a war of hostility, a war of narratives. And they knew that Diana's truth, her authenticity, her emotional resonance, her unfiltered humanity, was far more powerful than any strategy they could craft. This confrontation is what pushed Diana to write the letter. Not fear, not panic, not impulse, clarity. This was the moment she understood with complete certainty that her story would one day be rewritten by someone else. Unless she left behind her own version. Her son needed that version. Her legacy depended on it. And the palace? They had no idea she was writing it. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Because someone else in the palace overheard snippets of this confrontation, someone who shouldn't have been there, someone who stayed silent for decades. And what they would eventually reveal takes us straight into the next chapter. Because what happened after Diana left that room? set off a chain of events no one, not even her, could have predicted. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like clarity, a sudden realization, a cold understanding of how the world works behind the scenes, especially a world as polished, choreographed, and guarded as the royal family. Diana's greatest fear wasn't danger. It wasn't threat. It wasn't harm. It was something much more devastating. Erasure. The slow, polite, institutional erasure of who she was, what she stood for, and how the world remembered her. That is the fear that pushed her to write the letter. That is the fear that kept her awake at night in those final days. And that is the fear that William would eventually read with trembling hands decades later. But what exactly did Diana fear would happen? Let's unravel the truth one step at a time, because the answer isn't a single event. It's a pattern, a series of small, quiet steps that would accumulate until her public identity was no longer hers. And the place to begin is with the one question Diana asked herself constantly. What will they say about me when I'm no longer here to correct them? Imagine that question living in your mind. Imagine carrying it like a shadow. Imagine watching stories appear in the press, stories you didn't authorize, versions of you that never existed, and knowing you had no control over any of it. Diana wasn't afraid of being forgotten. She was afraid of being rewritten. And she had good reason. Let's go back to the period after her divorce, when she stepped out of the royal structure but never fully escaped its reach. Diana noticed something immediately. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but unmistakable to someone as emotionally perceptive as she was. People spoke to her differently. Not rudely, not aggressively, but cautiously. Staff members who once confided in her started measuring their words. Advisors who once sought her input now avoided long discussions. Journalists who once praised her now wrote with a tone of concern or critique. She wasn't inside the system anymore. She wasn't under their protection. And she wasn't shaping the story. Others were. And in that vacuum, Diana sensed the beginning of a shift, a coordinated, carefully managed reframing of her image. An image that no longer benefited everyone. A friend later recalled a chilling moment during tea one afternoon. Diana put down her cup, stared into space, and whispered, "They're preparing for a future I no longer fit in." That sentence is the key to understanding everything. Because Diana didn't fear losing relevance. She feared losing authorship. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone else tell your story and tell it wrong? It feels like a theft, a removal, a quiet suffocation. Now imagine that happening on a global stage. Imagine millions hearing a version of your life that isn't yours. Imagine an institution with centuries of influence shaping how you are perceived without your consent. That is what Diana feared. But there was another layer to her fear, a deeper, more personal one. She believed Camilla would be at the center of that rewritten narrative. Not violently, not maliciously in a physical sense, but strategically, quietly, inevitably. Because Camilla had what Diana lacked, something subtle yet powerful, institutional alignment. If Diana was beloved by the people, Camilla was aligned with the system. If Diana was unpredictable, Camilla was consistent. If Diana brought emotion, Camilla brought neutrality. If Diana broke rules, Camilla understood them. And institutions love people who understand their rules. Diana feared that once Camilla stepped into the public role beside Charles, the palace would begin the slow process of rehabilitating her image. And the easiest way to do that was to reduce Diana's presence in the narrative. The logic was simple. For the new role to shine, the past must dim. And Diana, whether she wanted to or not, knew she represented the past the monarchy wanted to move away from. But her fears went even deeper. She feared that her sons would grow up hearing a version of her story that wasn't hers. She feared that William, especially William, would be subtly influenced by the palace's narrative, pressured to accept an official version of his mother that wasn't true. She feared that when he became king, he would inherit a story crafted by others. So let's break down the specific fears that drove her to pick up that pen and write that letter. Fear number 1. She feared becoming the problematic princess. Diana noticed a shift in media coverage after her divorce. Articles began describing her as unstable, emotional, unpredictable. Her compassion was reframed as fragility. Her vulnerability became a weapon against her credibility. This wasn't accidental. It was narrative groundwork. When institutions want to rewrite someone's role, they start by questioning their stability. Diana saw it happening in real time. Fear number 2. She feared being replaced in the public story. Diana didn't fear Camilla taking Charles's side publicly. That wound had closed years earlier. The fear was symbolic. That Camilla's rise would coincide with Diana's narrative decline. She once told a friend, "It won't be sudden. It'll be slow. A quiet removal." And she was right. Replacements in history don't happen in headlines. They happen in footnotes, in soft language, in the reorganization of photos, in who gets mentioned and who doesn't, in which names appear in royal biographies, and which names fade out. Fear number 3. She feared her humanitarian work being diminished. Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a global figure for compassion. Landmine survivors, AIDS patients, homeless families. She gave a voice to those the world overlooked. And she feared that after her divorce, the palace would downplay or reinterpret her activism as emotional overreach. She once said, "I don't want my boys to think I was just a headline." Fear number 4. She feared a future generation not truly knowing her. This fear was the most personal. Diana knew the royal family controlled archives, speeches, biographies, official photos, press strategies, historical retellings. She knew that the version of her the palace preserved would not be the version her sons knew. The real her, the emotional her, the flawed but fiercely loving mother she was. She feared that one day William might hear a version of her so sanitized, so softened, so strategically rewritten, that he would no longer recognize the woman who raised him. Fear number 5. She feared Camilla shaping the narrative after she was gone. Not harming her, not threatening her, but shaping how the world remembered her. She once told a confidant, "If I don't write my truth now, it will disappear." This was the core of her fear. A future where her voice was replaced by someone else's story. And that brings us to the most painful part of Diana's fear, the part that ultimately led her to write a letter to her son. She feared that Camilla's eventual rise as Charles's partner would mean the monarchy would intentionally frame Camilla as the steady, stable figure, and Diana as the unstable, emotional one. The contrast would rewrite history, and Diana refused to let that happen. Let me ask you one more question. If you believed the world would forget the truth unless you wrote it down, wouldn't you, right? Of course you would. So she wrote. She wrote to hold on to her story. She wrote because she feared the palace would not hold it for her. She wrote because she knew William deserved to know the version the world might one day hide from him. She wrote out of love. She wrote out of fear. She wrote out of foresight. And the letter was not just emotional, it was strategic. Inside that letter, she did something brilliant and heartbreaking. She predicted exactly what would happen. She predicted the soft erasure, the reframing, the institutional pivot, the rise of a new figure, the diminishing of her own. She predicted the thing she feared most, that her memory would one day be curated by someone who did not have her best interests at heart. And her final fear? Fear number 6. She feared being framed as the cause of her own downfall. Not physically, but emotionally, publicly, reputationally. She feared that the palace would make it seem like she fell apart on her own, as if her struggles were personal weaknesses rather than responses to systemic pressure. She feared the narrative of the unstable princess becoming the accepted history. She feared being blamed, and that fear became the emotional anchor of her letter. She wanted William to know. None of this happened because she was weak. None of this happened because she was reckless. None of this happened because she was unstable. It happened because she challenged a system that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity. It happened because she loved loudly in a world that prefers its royals quiet. It happened because she was real, and real people disrupt carefully crafted narratives. And that is why she wrote the letter. But before you think you fully understand the depth of Diana's fears, we need to explore the most revealing part of all. Diana didn't just fear what would happen to her story. She feared who would control it. And the identity of that person is the final twist of this chapter. Because Diana believed, with painful clarity, that once she was gone, the person who would influence the shaping of her legacy was already inside the palace. Not future, not hypothetical, not ambiguous. Someone already present, someone already influential, someone already preparing to step forward. And that fear leads directly, perfectly, chillingly, into the moment where her son would discover the letter years later. But before we get there, we need to reveal the moment Diana realized she was right. Because something happened after she wrote that letter. Something that confirmed her worst fears. Something that pushed the palace into panic. And something that ties everything together in a way absolutely no one expected. He wasn't supposed to find it. Not that early. Not at that age. Not in that moment. But fate doesn't wait for the right moment. It hits when you least expect it. Especially in a family where secrets are stored in silk-lined drawers and truth is locked behind gold handles. William was still a teenager, not a boy, not yet a man. Caught in that strange, painful space where the world expects you to be strong, but your heart is still learning how to carry real weight. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to uncover. Let's start with the part no one ever talks about. William didn't go searching for the letter. The letter found him. And the way it happened is something only fiction dares to reveal. It was a quiet afternoon inside Kensington Palace. One of those days where the walls feel too big and the corridors too empty. William had wandered into a room he rarely visited. His mother's old sitting room. It hadn't been touched in years. Not truly. Not emotionally. The cleaners dusted it. The staff preserved it. But no one inhabited it. It was a room frozen in time. Her favorite table still polished. Her books still aligned by height. Her cushions still arranged the way she preferred. Slightly angled, never perfectly symmetrical. William stepped inside as if crossing into a memory. He hadn't allowed himself to visit this room often. It hurt too much. The air still smelled faintly of her perfume. That light floral scent that never fully left the upholstery. Being inside this room felt like waking up an old wound. But something drew him in that day. A restlessness. A heaviness he couldn't explain. A whisper from the past he didn't know he needed to hear. He moved across the room slowly, fingertips brushing the edges of her things. The framed photos. The handwritten notes pinned to her corkboard. The stack of magazines she never finished reading. And then, as if guided by instinct, he approached the bookshelf. The one she used most often. The one she kept closest to her heart. He scanned the spines absent-mindedly. Titles on healing. On compassion. On surviving emotional storms. Books she had collected during the hardest years of her life. He reached for one, a small, worn paperback she had underlined heavily. It wasn't anything remarkable, just a book on resilience. But the moment he took it down, he heard it. A soft, delicate sound. A slip. A whisper of paper falling between pages. His breath caught. Because William knew his mother. She used bookmarks. Pressed flowers. Receipts. But not loose sheets of paper. Not unless it meant something. He opened the book carefully, almost reverently. And there it was. Folded into thirds. Edges softened by time. Ink slightly faded. Handwriting unmistakably hers. He froze. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. He knew that handwriting better than his own. The loops. The curves. The flourish on the D she only used when she wrote something serious. His knees felt weak. The world felt still. He sat down slowly, in her favorite armchair, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. His legs wouldn't hold him up anymore. He held the letter like it was glass. Fragile, irreplaceable, alive. He hesitated. Should he open it? Should he call someone? Should he put it back? But curiosity, grief, and longing collided inside him, forming a single, unstoppable emotion. He had to read it. He needed to hear her voice again. Even if it was only in ink. He unfolded the first crease, and the breath he didn't know he was holding escaped him all at once. Because the very first line wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It wasn't a greeting. It was a warning. My darling William, if you are reading this, it means the story told about me is no longer mine. He read that line 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood it too well. A chill swept down his spine. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it echo in his ears. His hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of the shock of realizing this wasn't a note. This wasn't a diary entry. It was a message meant for him, a message she feared he would one day need. He read on. She wrote about her loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness, the kind the public imagines, but the quiet isolation of being surrounded by people who didn't see the real her. She wrote about her worries. About the stories being crafted around her. Stories polished by advisors. stories leaked by people who once pretended to care. She wrote about the narratives she couldn't control, and then she wrote about the one thing she feared most. My voice may not carry into the future. Others may speak louder than I ever could. William paused. It hit him hard, because he had heard whispers, rumors, comments from staff, shifts in tone whenever his mother's name came up. But he had always believed the truth would protect her memory. He had no idea she feared otherwise. He kept reading. She talked about the years of emotional pressure, the expectations, the unspoken rules, the feeling of being watched not for protection, but for compliance. She described a world where fitting the mold mattered more than telling the truth. A world where her authenticity was her greatest strength and her greatest threat. William blinked slowly. He could almost hear her saying it aloud. Then came the part that made him swallow hard. There will come a time when a new story will rise. A story that puts someone else where I once stood. His chest tightened, not because of the words, but because he knew exactly who she meant. She didn't write Camilla's name. She didn't need to. She described a woman who understands the system and uses it gracefully. A woman who will be positioned beside your father. A woman who will eventually shape how the world sees the past. William's jaw clenched. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was realization. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't bitterness. This was foresight. His mother had predicted a future where her legacy would be softened to make room for another. His pulse quickened. He flipped the page. The next lines hit harder than anything before. She wrote about his future, about the crown he would one day inherit, about the pressures she knew he would face, about the version of her story he would be told when he was older. And then she wrote the line that would shape the rest of his life. When that time comes, trust what you remember, not what they tell you. William inhaled sharply, because he remembered. Oh, he remembered. Her laughter, her tears, her hugs, her late-night talks, her devotion to her sons, her pain, her courage, her fight. He remembered everything. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't dramatic. She was strong. She was real. She was human. And she wanted him to never forget that. But the part that truly shook him came near the end of the letter. A single sentence, carefully written, underlined twice. There is someone who will try to rewrite who I was. You will know when it happens. William felt his heart stop for a moment. Because deep down, he already knew. He wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't naive. He wasn't protected from whispers or newspaper headlines or palace gossip. He knew the battles being fought around him. He knew the shifts in public tone. And he knew, painfully, that someone had already begun shaping a narrative that placed his mother in the shadows. His hands tightened around the paper. Not in rage. Not in despair. In determination. Because this was no longer just a letter. It was a responsibility. A torch passed from mother to son. A truth entrusted to him alone. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear her voice. Quiet. Firm. Loving. But there was more. At the very bottom of the page, barely noticeable, was something he hadn't expected. A second fold. A hidden flap. Another page tucked inside. His pulse quickened as he opened it. This page wasn't like the others. The handwriting was smaller, more rushed, more emotional, and the words at the top hit him like a tidal wave. I wrote this only for you, William. His breath caught. Only for him. Not for Harry. Not for the public. Not for history. For him. And what she wrote next, that was the part that broke him open and rebuilt him in the same instant. My truth will not survive unless you carry it. Promise me you will remember who I was. A tear slid down his cheek, slowly, silently. Because she hadn't asked him to fight, or defend, or argue. She asked him to remember, to hold her story, to keep it alive, to protect the version of her the world might one day try to silence. And he did promise. Right there. Right then. Alone in her old armchair, holding the last words she ever wrote to him. He promised her. But promises come with consequences. And when William finally folded the letter back into its creases, something shifted inside him. A clarity. A purpose. A fire. The kind of fire that only ignites when a son realizes his mother foresaw a future he is now living in. But before he could stand up, before he could even breathe properly, he sensed something else. A presence. A shadow in the doorway. Someone had been watching, and what they saw would change everything. And absolutely no one saw it coming. Because nothing is louder than the secrets royalty keeps silent. And that week, the week William discovered the letter, the palace was louder than it had been in years. Let's begin where the tension truly started. With the shadow standing in the doorway, William looked up abruptly, the letter still